Chapter 1. A cup of tea and an unfinished case. Miss Marple's cozy sitting room in the quaint village of St. Mary Mead was a pleasant mixture of tradition and warmth. The walls, a gentle shade of cream, were adorned with a collection of small, gilded framed paintings of pastoral scenes. A number of them had been passed down to Miss Marple by relatives long forgotten by the rest of the world, but still dear to the ever-observant spinster sleuth. The afternoon sun streamed through the lace curtains, casting dappled patterns across the worn, comfortable armchairs. The carpet underfoot, slightly faded in places, carried the lingering scents of lavender sachets and a hint of beeswax polish, a testament to Miss Marple's longtime housekeeper's diligence. On this particular afternoon, Miss Marple was entertaining 3 visitors: her nephew Raymond, Raymond's wife Joan, and Raymond's longtime friend, the 55-year-old lawyer Alfred Billington, known more familiarly as Uncle Alfred, though he was no blood relation. There was no hustle or bustle in St. Mary Mead that day. Outside, the narrow lanes with their neatly trimmed hedges were quiet, except for an occasional breeze, rustling the leaves of the tall elms that flanked the high street. Raymond, a slim man with salt-and-pepper hair and an amiable expression, settled himself carefully into one of Miss Marple's daintier chairs. He had once been something of a bohemian in London, scribbling his novels and short stories, but marriage and middle age had tempered his flamboyance into a quieter, contemplative nature. His wife Joan occupied the sofa. She was petite, her blonde hair pinned up in an elegant chignon, giving her an air of refined grace. She wore a neat day dress in a soft floral print, practical, yet in perfect taste for an afternoon visit in the English countryside. Across from them sat Alfred Billington, a rather distinguished-looking gentleman with a square jaw and well-groomed silver hair. He exuded an air of quiet confidence that suggested his many years of legal experience had served him well. Only the faint lines around his eyes hinted at his age. Alfred had come to St. Mary Mead for a weekend of fresh air and relaxation, hoping to speak with Raymond about some minor literary matter. Miss Marple herself sat in her favorite chair near the window, her knitting needles in hand, though she wasn't currently knitting. Instead, she watched her guests with those clear blue eyes that missed nothing. There was a soft smile on her lips, for she was quite pleased to have her drawing-room filled with chatter and laughter. Even so, as always, she remained on the lookout for those little human nuances that might reveal far more than was said aloud. After a brief discussion about the usual pleasantries, local gossip, the weather, and the welfare of various acquaintances, Joan leaned forward, addressing the lawyer with unconcealed curiosity. "Uncle Alfred," she began, her tone lively, "you've solved so many cases, haven't you? In all your years of practice, you must have come across some truly intriguing puzzles. I've been meaning to ask you for ages. Could you tell us about a case you've never managed to solve? Something that might still haunt you?" Raymond, quick to seize on this notion, added, "Yes, I've heard your stories before, Alfred, and they've always been so fascinating. You love a challenge more than anyone I know. Surely there must be one case that you've never cracked, some cold trail or baffling twist that refuses to make sense. Why don't you tell us about it? Who knows, we might stumble upon a solution." Alfred Billington's countenance, relaxed and genial thus far, took on a curious intensity. He leaned back in his chair, tenting his fingers and regarding Raymond and Joan thoughtfully. "A case I haven't solved," he repeated in a measured tone, as though turning the idea around in his mind. "Yes, there is one." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. The shadows of the window curtains shifted slightly, heralding a gentle gust of wind outside. Miss Marple allowed her knitting needles to clack together softly in her lap. She knew from long experience that such a silence was precisely the kind that often preludes a confession, or, at the very least, a compelling story. She sensed a faint excitement in Joan's manner, the younger woman's eyes brightening at the notion of a mystery. Miss Marple herself never could resist an interesting puzzle, no matter how far-fetched or complicated it might be. Alfred cleared his throat with deliberate poise. "I doubt this story would interest you," he said, a wry curve tugging at one corner of his mouth. "After all, it's a problem that I, with my many years of legal and investigative expertise, could not solve. I can't possibly see how any of you—" Here he included Miss Marple, in his glance, though politely, "would manage." Joan's lips parted as if to protest. Raymond, more direct, went straight to the point. "Come now, Alfred, give us the details. Perhaps a fresh perspective can shed light on a long-forgotten clue." Alfred's eyebrows rose ever so slightly. "I admire your optimism, Raymond," he said softly. Then with a dismissive wave, he continued, "But I fear it's quite beyond you." It was at that moment that Miss Marple, who had been listening in that deceptively mild and sweet way of hers, let out a small, tinkling laugh. Her guests glanced at her in surprise, for she so rarely interjected during the initial exposition of a tale. But there was something in her expression, knowing yet kind, that made it impossible to resent her amusement. "My dear Alfred," she said, gently laying down her knitting upon her lap, "one should never presume that a problem unsolvable to one person is unsolvable to everyone. Why, I recall a certain Colonel Melcher once expressing the same sentiment, only to be proven quite mistaken. It was a matter of 2 missing cameo brooches, if memory serves." Alfred blinked. He appeared slightly taken aback by Miss Marple's recollection, though it was hard to say whether it was because she had contradicted him so calmly, or because she had done so by referencing a personal anecdote. "Yes, well," he said, clearing his throat once more, "you may be correct, Miss Marple, but this case is different. Even so, if everyone insists, I suppose I might indulge you in the details." Before Alfred could begin his story, the door to the drawing-room opened quietly. Miss Marple's maid, Lucy, a pleasant-faced young woman with a tidy uniform, entered, balancing a tea-tray laden with a silver teapot, mismatched porcelain cups, for Miss Marple had never been too bothered by complete sets, a small jug of cream, and an array of biscuits and scones. She placed the tray on the low table in front of Miss Marple and offered a polite, practiced curtsy. "Thank you, Lucy," Miss Marple said, smiling affectionately at the maid. "You're just in time." Lucy looked at the visitors with a slight glimmer of curiosity in her eyes, no doubt wondering about the hush that had settled over the room. Alfred, for his part, had closed his lips in anticipation of continuing his tale, but Miss Marple, per her hospitality, insisted that everyone take tea first. "Now let's have a cup," said Miss Marple, deftly pouring out the steaming liquid into each cup, using an embroidered tea cozy to keep the pot from losing its heat too quickly. "I find that a warm cup of tea always helps the mind focus, don't you, Alfred?" Alfred inclined his head politely, though the corners of his mouth still held that faint hint of skepticism. "Indeed, Miss Marple," he conceded. "I suppose it can't hurt." The atmosphere grew tranquil once again as the little gathering partook of their tea. Raymond spooned sugar into his cup, stirring idly while he studied Alfred's countenance. Joan's eyes gleamed with anticipation. As for Miss Marple, she was serene, like an attentive cat waiting for a mouse to appear. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast a golden glow on the well-tended garden. From her seat, Miss Marple could see the neat rows of roses she had planted the previous spring. Perhaps, she mused, the light of the setting sun might have mirrored that gentle warmth of curiosity that now illuminated each of her visitors' faces. "I do wonder," Raymond began quietly, "if this old, unsolved case has anything to do with a murder." He spoke the last words softly, as if loath to disturb the peace of Miss Marple's home with its dark connotations. "It would hardly surprise me. You've made something of a specialty of unraveling them, haven't you, Alfred?" Alfred lifted his cup to his lips, taking a measured sip. Then, setting the cup back onto its saucer with a faint clink, he said, "Indeed I have. And yes, it has to do with a murder, one that occurred under highly peculiar circumstances. But rest assured I'll share everything, though I must insist, it is not a story for the faint of heart." Joan leaned forward eagerly. "We aren't faint of heart, Uncle Alfred, not at all." Raymond nodded, and a slight smile lit his features. Miss Marple, ever the epitome of gentle courtesy, simply inclined her head. "Please," she said, "feel free to speak freely. We're quite all ears." Alfred let out a little sigh, though he looked almost pleased by their interest. "Very well," he said, a resolution in his voice. "But you must promise not to hold me accountable if this only ends in frustration." Miss Marple gave a soft laugh, her eyes twinkling. "We shall do our best, I'm sure. Things often become clearer with a fresh perspective." So it was that they all finished their tea in a rare moment of hush before turning their full attention to Alfred Billington. Outside, the dimming sky hinted that evening was not far away, as though nature herself were preparing a stage for the telling of a dark and unexplained mystery. The hush of the room, the soft ticking of the mantel clock, the slight rustle of Miss Marple's lace curtains, all seemed to create the perfect backdrop for what promised to be a story that would captivate them all, and, if Miss Marple had any say in it, might well lead to a solution that had eluded Alfred for far too long. With the last sip of tea consumed, and Miss Marple's maid having quietly collected the tray, Alfred straightened in his chair. The lines around his mouth tensed, revealing a man bracing himself to revisit something both troubling and enthralling. And with all eyes upon him, he began, his voice holding a note of suspense that for a moment made the cozy drawing-room feel like the threshold of a place far darker, far more mysterious than the gentle streets of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 2. Between Loss and Legacy. The afternoon sun had shifted by the time Uncle Alfred cleared his throat, signaling he was ready to begin his story in earnest. The gentle rattle of teacups subsided as Joan tucked a stray curl behind her ear. Raymond leaned forward in his chair, and Miss Marple quietly set aside her knitting, her bright eyes fixed on her old friend. Outside in the serene lanes of St. Mary Mead, the hush of early evening was settling. A few birds carried on a casual conversation, their calls faint through the lace-draped windows. Inside, however, tension and curiosity were high, each person bracing for whatever account Uncle Alfred was about to divulge. Alfred's gaze seemed to grow distant. He was no longer in Miss Marple's cozy parlor. In spirit, he was traveling back in time to another place, another house, one full of both love and sorrow. The others could almost see the memories playing out like a silent film in his mind before he began to speak. It all began with my dear friend Leo Pemberton, Alfred said at last, voice grave, yet tinged with affection. Leo and I had known each other since our school days. We shared the usual boyish adventures, climbing trees we weren't supposed to, getting into harmless mischief. And somehow, we stayed close right into adulthood, even as our lives took different paths. I chose law. He entered his family's modest export business. He married young, an elegant, spirited girl named Margaret, but tragedy struck early. Margaret died mere months after their daughter was born. A pause. He took a sip of his tea, as though wetting his throat might calm his roiling thoughts. Miss Marple, mindful as ever, handed him a napkin, which he accepted with a grateful nod. Leo was devastated, of course, Alfred continued, but he was also determined to raise his daughter Catherine with all the love and attention he could muster, and by all accounts Catherine thrived. She was bright, charming, and altogether delightful. Over time, as children do, she grew up, married a good-hearted fellow named Andrew, and they settled not too far from Leo's estate. 2 years into their marriage, Catherine gave birth to a baby girl, Ava. Oh, how Leo doted on that child. She was the apple of his eye. He used to say that having a granddaughter rekindled his sense of joy, something he feared he'd lost after losing Margaret. Outside, a soft breeze whispered through the shrubbery. Joan cast a quick glance out the window, then shifted her attention back to Uncle Alfred. He had set his teacup on the small table beside him. His hands were folded, but there was a faint tremor, as though the story he was relating touched him still. Ava was just 2 years old when tragedy struck again, Alfred went on, his tone low. Her parents, Catherine and Andrew, were in a terrible road accident. Both of them lost their lives, leaving little Ava an orphan. Naturally, Leo took her in at once. He raised her as if she were his own child, determined to fulfill every need, every whim. She grew into a lovely girl, bright-eyed, inquisitive, perhaps a touch spoiled, but in a charming way that never turned disagreeable. Leo found solace in that little soul, poured all his paternal affections into her upbringing, as if by caring for her, he might right the wrongs of fate. Alfred closed his eyes briefly, recalling the memory of a young girl's laughter echoing through a once stately home. "But life can be cruel," he said softly. "When Ava was 11, she fell ill with pneumonia. Despite the best doctors and round-the-clock care, she passed away within a fortnight." Leo was inconsolable, and if that heartbreak weren't enough, his brother, his last surviving immediate relative, died the very same month. Raymond gave a low whistle, as though he couldn't quite fathom such unrelenting sorrow. Joan's eyes were misty. She dabbed them delicately with a handkerchief. Even Miss Marple's face, though composed, showed her empathy in the furrow of her brow. Leo took these 2 losses very hard, Alfred continued. His health began to fail soon after. He had no wife, no daughter, and now no granddaughter to care for him. But his brother had left 3 children behind, Agnes, Jorge, and Mary. They were Leo's closest kin, and they came to live with him, partly to inherit the role of companion he had lost, and partly because they, too, had nowhere else to go. It might have been a new beginning of sorts, but Leo's heart was broken, and no force on earth seemed strong enough to mend it. At this, Alfred paused as though conjuring again the memory of these 3 young people stepping into the silent corridors of Leo's home. Agnes, the eldest, was a striking girl, tall, confident, with a decisive manner. She eventually married and moved out not long after arriving. Jorge, the only son, secured a job in the city. He commuted and seldom stayed at the house during the week. That left Mary, the youngest, to shoulder the task of caring for Leo. Miss Marple stirred in her seat, leaning forward slightly. "Mary must have been a very compassionate soul," she observed. "It can't have been easy for a young girl to tend to an ailing man weighed down by so many sorrows." Alfred nodded. "You're quite right. Mary was quiet but warm-hearted. From what I observed, she had a nurturing spirit, and she took her responsibilities seriously. She cooked, ensured Leo's medications were administered, tended the house, though the estate had dwindled in staff, and did her best to bring a semblance of life back into those old walls. Whether Leo fully appreciated her efforts in his grief, I can't be certain, but I do know he relied on her more than anyone else. Joan, who had recovered her composure, asked gently, "You mentioned earlier that Leo's health continued to decline." "He was bedridden at times," Alfred explained, "and his constitution, once robust, grew frail from heartbreak as much as from any medical ailment. Then one day, I received a phone call. It was Mary's voice, trembling, saying that her uncle was asking for me, insisting I come at once. I went without hesitation." He paused long enough to accept a fresh cup of tea from Miss Marple, then, warming his hands around the porcelain, he continued. "When I arrived, I found Leo in bed. He looked terribly pale, his eyes sunken, his hair more white than gray. Yet his mind was sharp, and his request was straightforward if a little abrupt. He wanted me as his lawyer and friend to draw up his will. Right there and then, he started dictating its contents. Raymond couldn't resist interjecting. I've heard of deathbed wills before. They can be quite complicated. Did he seem certain of what he wanted?" "Oh, perfectly certain. With the inheritance line so diminished by tragedy, he chose to divide his property among his 3 surviving relatives, Agnes, Jorge, and Mary." He spoke calmly, though with a subdued sense of finality, as if this was the last significant act he would perform, and I, of course, documented his wishes with as much care and clarity as possible. At that point, Alfred's eyes clouded with a hint of sorrow, or was it unease? He shifted in his seat. I drew up the paperwork, had him sign in the presence of witnesses, Mary and the butler, an elderly fellow named Bromley. We all believed the matter was settled, and, for the time being, it was. A hush fell in Miss Marple's parlor. Even the ticking of the mantel clock seemed to grow louder in the silence. At length, Miss Marple ventured. "So I take it the inheritance was straightforward enough. What made this case unsolvable, then? Surely a man leaving his estate to his close relatives isn't so unusual." Alfred set down his cup with a soft clink. "Indeed, that is the question," he said quietly. "Leo's passing, the will's execution, all these events that followed. There were peculiar circumstances that arose, ones that neither the local authorities nor I could make sense of. And though there was no immediate suggestion of foul play or wrongdoing, what happened next turned the entire household, indeed the entire matter, into a puzzle so baffling I've never quite untangled it." Joan's breath caught. "So there's more?" "Yes," Alfred said, his voice grim. "Much more. Leo's death itself was only the beginning. Strange incidents occurred and rumors stirred. Whispers that a crime of some sort may have been committed. But no one, not even I with all my legal experience, could find the slightest credible proof. Each clue led to a dead end, every suspicion twisted upon itself. Chapter 3. Shadows at the Pemberton estate. It was late on a brisk autumn afternoon when I unexpectedly crossed paths with Jorge Pemberton. He looked drawn and anxious, quite unlike the reserved young man I remembered. He hurried toward me, calling my name as I was locking up my chambers after a day's work. The moment we were face to face, he gripped my arm and, in a shaky voice, requested that I speak to his uncle Leo again. His words stunned me. Leo, or he claimed, had lost his senses. It was not a statement to be taken lightly, and I must admit, I felt immediate indignation on Leo's behalf. Though I knew the toll of grief could wear away at a person's mind, Jorge's blunt announcement struck me as unkind. "You ought not to speak that way about your uncle," I said, perhaps too sternly. But Jorge, looking stricken, apologized, and insisted I hear him out. He then confided what had been happening at the Pemberton estate over the past few months. A woman named Amelia had arrived, accompanied by her husband Smith. They claimed some distant connection to Leo, but neither Jorge nor Mary, Leo's young niece, who tended to him daily, recognized the couple. At first, Amelia and Smith seemed well-meaning, eager to relieve Mary of her constant duties. But before long, odd rumors started to circulate. Leo had begun telling everyone that Amelia and Smith performed late-night rituals in the house, supposedly allowing him to speak with his deceased granddaughter, Ava. The mere mention of Ava was enough to make my heart sink. I remembered the bright-eyed girl and the devastation her loss had caused Leo. According to Jorge, his uncle now insisted that Amelia and Smith could summon Ava, that he could see and hear her in the dark hours of the night. Whenever Jorge or Mary tried to challenge this notion, Leo flew into a rage. He seemed convinced these strangers were the only ones who truly understood his grief. Alarmed by Jorge's account, I offered to visit Leo in hopes of settling the matter, but I knew I might need a more specialized perspective, so I brought along my friend George, a serious scholar of folklore and superstition. George had spent years studying the historical roots of so-called magic, and while he was no believer in genuine sorcery, he understood the theatrics that often accompanied fraudulent claims of the supernatural. If Amelia and Smith were tricksters, George would be quick to see through them. We arrived at the Pemberton estate on a cool morning. The house looked as I remembered, a stately old manor set back from a gravel drive, its facade somber beneath a canopy of gently swaying oaks. Yet the atmosphere felt subtly altered, as if the shadows clung more tightly to the corners. Mary greeted us at the door, her eyes reflecting both relief at our arrival and a weariness that hinted at long, sleepless nights. She led us into the drawing room, where we found Leo seated in an upholstered chair near the hearth. A shawl draped his shoulders, and though he was only in his mid-60s, he appeared considerably older. His once sharp gaze clouded as he looked at us. Still, he managed a faint, welcoming smile when he recognized me. I introduced George as a friend with an interest in unusual traditions, hoping to appease Leo's newfound fascination with spiritual matters. But before I could explain further, Amelia glided into the room. Tall and dark-haired, she wore a black dress with lace sleeves and bore herself with a curious mixture of confidence and restraint. Smith followed close behind, lean and quiet, his eyes darting over George and me as if sizing us up. Leo greeted them both with what could only be described as reverence. "Amelia," he said softly, "these are my old friends. They've come to learn about the marvelous things you do." Amelia inclined her head toward us but did not smile. "Mr. Pemberton has told us much about you," she said. "We understand you're skeptical of our practices." George cleared his throat. "Merely curious," he replied gently. "I find the subject of spiritual communication utterly fascinating." Leo's eyes lit up at that. "They've helped me speak to Ava," he declared, voice quivering. "She appears to me each night, wearing that white nightgown of hers. She tells me she's safe, that she watches over me." My heart twisted at his words. The longing behind them was painfully real. If only there were a way to bring him genuine solace. Amelia, however, cast a guarded look my way. "We're careful to shield Mr. Pemberton from negative energies," she said. "That means we generally don't allow outside observers." George gave a polite bow of his head. "I understand. But I'd be remiss not to ask, do you think a brief demonstration might be possible?" Amelia's countenance hardened. She turned slightly as if seeking confirmation from Smith. He spoke at last, his tone as quiet as his demeanor. "The presence of doubters can disrupt the delicate threads that bind our world to the spirit realm." Leo seemed troubled by George's request too. "Alfred," he implored, turning to me, "please don't push them. I can't lose the chance to see Ava again. If you or George do anything to disturb the connection, I'd never forgive you." I could see the torment in his eyes, and it hurt to know my attempts to protect him were viewed as potential sabotage. Gently, I tried to reason with him. "Leo, my friend, no one wants to take Ava from you. We want to ensure what you're experiencing is genuine." He stiffened, clutching the arms of his chair. "Are you saying I'm imagining it?" His voice rose, and Amelia quickly placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, as if to steady him. "We don't mean that," George interjected softly. "We only seek clarity. Sometimes charlatans prey on people's grief, and—" That was enough to make Leo spring up, nearly dislodging the shawl from his shoulders. "How dare you speak to Amelia and Smith that way?" he demanded, the flush of anger rising to his cheeks. "They've given me hope I thought I'd never feel again." At once, Smith moved forward. "Mr. Pemberton, calm yourself," he said gently, though his gaze was icy. "Let us show these gentlemen out. You shouldn't upset yourself with their skepticism." Reluctantly, I realized there was no talking sense to Leo that day. We had stirred his indignation, and with Amelia and Smith at his side, he seemed beyond our reach. George caught my eye, a look of frustration on his face, but we both knew we had little choice but to withdraw. By the time we found ourselves in the entry hall, Mary had reappeared, her face pale. She apologized quietly for her uncle's outburst, as though she felt personally responsible for the scene. I laid a hand on her shoulder, reassuring her that none of this was her fault. George likewise offered a kind word, but we couldn't stay. Stepping outside, we paused on the gravel drive, neither of us immediately willing to leave the imposing estate behind. The wind rustled a line of poplars in the distance, a low whisper that seemed to mirror our own uneasy thoughts. "Leo's grief has made him vulnerable," George said at last, pushing a strand of hair back from his forehead. "And this Amelia and Smith, whether they're misguided or something more sinister, I can't be certain, but I doubt their motives are pure." I nodded in agreement, my mind already trying to plan a way forward. "We must find a way to expose whatever it is they're doing," I said, "before Leo's finances, or worse yet, his sanity, suffer irrevocably." He gave me a somber look. "We'll need evidence, and we'll have to tread carefully. Leo's trust is fragile now." "Agreed," I said, exhaling a weary sigh. Together we moved toward the gates, each of us turning back for a final glance at the silent house, as though seeking some assurance. Yet the windows gave no answers. They stood closed and inscrutable, concealing the secrets, and perhaps the danger, brewing within. With the estate behind us, we set our resolve. We would not abandon Leo even if he believed we were his enemies. Amelia and Smith might have found a foothold in his sorrow, but we intended to uncover the truth. And as George and I trudged down the lane, the autumn breeze swirling leaves around our feet, I could only hope our next visit would not be too late to save my dear friend from the shadows closing in around him. Chapter 4. A change of heart, or a change of will. I arrived at Leo's estate on a foggy morning, the damp chill clinging to every surface. The grand front doors, heavy oak, carved with swirling patterns, groaned as the old butler opened them for me. When I stepped inside, I could almost feel the tangible sense of unease trailing through the corridors. Each hallway seemed darker, each room more silent than on previous visits. The air itself felt tense, as though charged by secrets waiting to be revealed. Leo had summoned me by telephone, his voice so faint I could barely understand him. Over the line, he had sounded weak, almost breathless. It was enough to make me apprehensive about the state in which I might find him. As it turned out, my worries were not misplaced. I found him in the library, a place once filled with a warm glow from the high windows, and an impressive collection of old books. Now the draperies were half-drawn and the only light came from a single lamp on a side table. Leo himself was in an armchair, a blanket over his legs, his complexion noticeably pale. "You look unwell," I murmured, sinking into a chair opposite him. It pained me to see him so changed from the robust man I once knew, the man who had taught his granddaughter Ava how to feed the robins in the garden, or who had sat up late telling me stories of his travels. He waved away my concern with trembling fingers. "I have no time for coddling," he said quietly. "I've called you here on important business." His breath rattled in his chest. "I need to change my will." The pronouncement struck me like a physical blow. While Leo had always been protective of his estate, he was also devoted to his family, particularly to Jorge, Mary, and Agnes, who had all come under his roof after the tragedies that befell them. I took a moment to gather my thoughts before asking carefully, "What did you have in mind?" Leo cleared his throat. "I want to give Amelia and Smith the majority of my fortune," he said. £15,000 divided among my niece and nephew, but the rest, everything else, goes to them." His voice hardened as though he expected an argument. "I don't want any protests." I couldn't hide my shock. I had suspected Amelia and Smith were maneuvering for a share of Leo's wealth. However, to hand them nearly the entire estate at the expense of his own relations seemed unthinkable. The protest tumbled out of me before I could weigh my words. "Leo, this is outrageous. Are you so indebted to them for their spiritual assistance that you would leave almost nothing to your own blood?" My tone was sharper than intended, but the idea that these strangers might inherit most of his property was appalling. Leo's eyes blazed. Even in his frail condition, he found the strength to snap back. "They've given me more than you can imagine," he insisted. "Amelia and Smith understand my pain. They've helped me connect with Ava, truly connect." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "And before you say anything, I don't care if you disbelieve it. I know what I've seen." I tried once more to reason with him, gentling my voice. "I'm not questioning your experiences, Leo. But if you feel you owe Amelia and Smith something, then surely you can give them a portion of your estate without depriving your own family. Isn't it enough to set aside a sum of money for them, rather than the entire fortune?" He let out a shuddering sigh. "I've made my decision, and there's nothing more to say." Before I could protest again, Leo reached for a small bell on the table beside him and rang it. Within moments, his maid and his cook entered. The maid was a young woman with drawn features, her hands clasped tightly in front of her apron. The cook, a stout older man, stood at her side, clearly uncomfortable. "I need a pen," Leo told them curtly. "I'm going to write my new will and you two shall witness it." The maid stepped toward a tall cupboard in the corner, opening the left-hand drawer. Leo, impatiently tapping his blanket-covered knee, insisted, No, the pen is in the right drawer." The maid looked confused. "But I swear I put it in the left drawer this morning," she said. "It should be here." "You can't keep anything in its proper place, can you?" Leo snapped, his temper fraying. "Just find the pen." Eventually she produced it from the left drawer after all, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Leo grumbled under his breath, but he seized the pen without further comment. With visible effort, he began to write a document on a single sheet of heavy parchment. I couldn't help noticing how unsteady his hand was, each stroke of the pen wavering. He glanced at me now and then, but mostly he seemed intent on ignoring my disapproval. When he finished, he pushed the paper toward the maid and cook. "Sign," he commanded, "as witnesses, now." The pair exchanged uneasy glances but did as told, their signatures scrawled at the bottom. Meanwhile, a grim silence settled on the room, broken only by the rustle of paper and the faint crackling of the fireplace. Once the will was signed, I found myself stepping forward to gather it up, though my heart felt heavy. Something about this scenario felt dreadfully wrong. I slid the will into a small plastic bag, the corners crinkling against the paper as I sealed it. My thoughts whirled. Should I try again to dissuade Leo? Would it only push him further away? I recalled our last quarrel, which had ended with me being asked to leave his house. If I angered him too much now, he might refuse all future help. Intent on departing before we argued again, I thanked him in a stiff voice and walked toward the door. But at that moment, the plastic bag slipped from my hand. The maid, who was following at a discreet distance, stooped quickly and retrieved it, handing it back with a forced little smile. I muttered my thanks, tucking it into my coat pocket. All the while, Leo glowered from his chair, as though challenging me to say more. I forced a polite goodbye. "I'll take care of it," I assured him, patting the will in my pocket to signal that I understood the gravity of my duty. Chapter 5. The Vanishing Will. By the time I left Leo's sick room that afternoon, my nerves were ragged. Between his frail condition and his unsettling decision to bequeath almost his entire estate to Amelia and Smith, I found myself awash in worry. Yet I had to maintain composure, for I still believed there might be a chance to rescue Leo from what I suspected were nefarious influences. Had I known the day's events would take such a bizarre turn, I might have stayed longer in his room and kept a firmer watch over his affairs. I made my way to Jorge and Mary's quarters, situated at the opposite end of the corridor. Both siblings had been waiting for an update, pacing restlessly amid a jumble of unpacked trunks and family mementos. Tension hung thick in the air. Jorge, ever the thoughtful nephew, quickly took note of my fatigue and insisted on relieving me of my coat. I allowed him to do so, grateful to be rid of the extra weight. "You look troubled," Mary observed gently, indicating the small sofa where we could talk. She pushed aside a half-folded blanket so I could sit. "What's happened now? Uncle Leo called you rather unexpectedly." Taking a seat, I recounted the difficult conversation I'd just had with Leo, carefully omitting the more painful details. I spoke of his health, of his sudden desire to formalize a new will, and my deep unease about Amelia and Smith's involvement. Jorge listened intently, his brow furrowed in clear concern, while Mary's face betrayed her mounting anxiety. "I can't imagine why he'd leave everything to them," she said, twisting her hands together. "They've barely been here a few months yet. He seems enthralled by them." "That's precisely it," I said, my voice coming out more resigned than I'd intended. "Leo believes Amelia and Smith are giving him some profound gift, access to his beloved granddaughter Ava in the spirit world. I fear they're exploiting that grief. He is so convinced of their power that he'll do anything to keep them happy." Jorge shook his head. "I've tried speaking reason to him, but each time he grows furious. He even threatened to throw me out of the house for daring to question Amelia's intentions. We spent the better part of an hour discussing possible solutions. Ideas floated about, convincing local authorities, enlisting a doctor's intervention, or rallying other family members, but none seemed likely to succeed. Leo was, after all, still of sound mind in the legal sense, at least enough that no one could force his hand. Eventually, the three of us decided to step out into the garden, hoping a little fresh air might clear our heads. There we wandered through the well-tended paths, past carefully trimmed rose bushes and ornate statues worn by the weather. Autumn leaves in shades of copper and gold swirled around our ankles. It was a chilly day, so we didn't stay long, but, in my distraction, I failed to notice something quite important. I had left my coat, and with it, a certain small plastic bag containing Leo's new will, in Jorge's room. By the time I realized my mistake, the sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the estate. I excused myself, telling Jorge and Mary I had to retrieve my coat. Retracing my steps, I made my way upstairs to the door of Jorge's room. It stood slightly ajar, revealing a shaft of golden light that fell across the corridor's dark carpet. I hesitated a moment before stepping inside. The sight that met my eyes almost made me drop my keys. Amelia stood there, alone, near the very stand where my coat hung. At her feet lay the plastic bag that contained Leo's freshly signed will, the same one I had carefully placed in my coat's inner pocket. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. Amelia glanced up, her expression unreadable. There was neither guilt nor alarm on her face, just a curious, almost detached calm. Then she bent down, picked up the plastic bag, and extended it to me without a word. "Oh, thank you," I stammered, hastily tucking it beneath my arm. "I must have dropped it." Amelia's lips curved in what might have been a polite smile. "It seems so," she said softly. Then, without further explanation, she slipped past me and out into the corridor, footsteps echoing against the floorboards. My pulse hammered in my ears. What had she been doing in Jorge's room? And how had the will ended up on the floor? The more I considered it, the more certain I felt that something untoward had just occurred. Still, I decided not to pursue a confrontation right then. My priority was securing the document itself and checking its contents if need be, before Amelia or Smith had any further chance to tamper with it. Clutching the bag, I took my coat and hurried back downstairs. I left the estate soon afterward, troubled by what I had seen, yet wary of revealing my suspicions in case it made matters worse. I believed that once I was in my own office, my own domain of safety, I could better assess the situation. As it turned out, however, my office was already occupied when I arrived. Smith was already in the office. I placed the plastic bag containing the will on the table and went outside to make a phone call which lasted about 5 minutes. When I returned, Smith was still there and had begun boasting about himself. I told him we'd talk another time, and he left. After that, I put the bag with the will into the locker. A full month passed with no communication from Leo. My worries deepened, but other professional obligations kept me busy. Then one frosty morning, a telegram brought the worst possible news. Leo had died. Stunned and grieving, I opened the locker to retrieve the will, so that I might start the process of executing his final wishes. But as I unfolded the paper from the plastic bag, my heart lurched. The page was blank. Stunned, I examined it over and over. The signatures, the text, everything had vanished without a hint of smearing or erasure. Even the official stamp from the day Leo signed it was gone. A chill coursed through me. I tried to recall each step I'd taken, each opportunity someone might have had to switch or alter the will. Yet nothing made sense. No matter how I looked at it, the will had simply disappeared, leaving nothing but a spotless sheet of parchment behind. To this day, that puzzle remains unresolved, haunting me with the lingering questions of what truly happened in those final weeks of Leo's life, and precisely how a seemingly solid piece of paper could become a blank slate of mystery. Chapter 6. A curious joke and a clue revealed. The late afternoon sun slanted through Miss Marple's lace curtains, casting intricate patterns upon the carpet of her cozy sitting room. Cups and saucers clinked on the low table, remnants of the tea service Miss Marple's maid Lucy had brought earlier. Alfred, Joan, and Raymond were still gathered in a loose circle of armchairs, their expressions shifting from curiosity to puzzlement as they debated the conundrum of Leo's vanished will. For a moment, The tense atmosphere lifted when Miss Marple, who had been listening intently with her knitting needles idle on her lap, suddenly let out a soft laugh. It was a simple, genuine sound, one that drew immediate attention from the trio. Raymond, leaning forward in his seat, was the first to speak. "Aunt Jane," he asked, using his affectionate name for Miss Marple, "might I ask what amuses you so?" Miss Marple's eyes danced with mirth. "Hearing your conversation reminded me of an old joke from my childhood," she said. "One of our more mischievous students once played a little trick on our teacher. I recall it so vividly. Our teacher insisted that if there's only one egg yolk, you say the yolk of an egg is white, and if there are several, you say the yolks of eggs are white. But a child piped up with, 'But the yolk is yellow.' And of course, we all burst into laughter." She paused, a nostalgic smile softening her features. "It was a lesson about assumptions, you see, how we sometimes accept something as a rule without noticing the obvious." Joan, who had been listening with a smile, now wore a thoughtful expression. "It's an interesting parallel, Aunt Jane. We might be missing something obvious here, too." Alfred, however, wasn't so quick to abandon the puzzle of the will. He'd been pacing by the window, occasionally glancing at the overcast sky beyond the glass. "I still don't understand it," he said, turning back to face the others. Amelia and Smith certainly had the opportunity to tamper with Leo's will. They were in close proximity at critical moments. But if the final result was a blank page, how on earth would that benefit them? Why would they sabotage their own gain? Raymond shrugged. "Maybe they panicked at the last second and decided they'd better not risk forging a new will," he offered. "Although that doesn't quite ring true, does it?" "No," Joan interjected firmly. "I'm convinced they'd have everything to gain from altering the will to favor themselves, or at least to keep it intact so they could inherit. Rendering it void or blank makes no sense." Alfred nodded in agreement. "Precisely. Their actions, if it was them, stand at odds with any logical motive they might have had." Joan pressed on. "Well, what about Jorge and Mary? They certainly have a motive, ensuring the old will stands, or that a new one is invalidated, so they might inherit everything. But they had no opportunity to meddle with the document. Alfred, you were with them for much of the time, and then they were never alone with that plastic bag containing the will. At least not as far as we know." Alfred's brow furrowed. "Exactly my dilemma. They do stand to benefit, but there was no conceivable moment for them to perform such a neat trick, let alone vanish the entire text." Raymond ran a hand through his hair. "That leaves only one person, the maid. She was present when the plastic bag fell. Joan thinks she might have switched it or done something in those few seconds." Alfred offered a tired sigh. "But it would take a skilled magician to accomplish that within a mere instant. Besides, from what I observed, the poor maid looked more flustered than cunning. She was hardly alone with the paper long enough to make such a thorough alteration." At that, the four of them seemed to reach an impasse, each suspect discounted by some combination of motive and opportunity. The conversation lulled, and a light hush settled over the room. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, rustling the neatly trimmed bushes beneath the sitting-room window. It was then that Miss Marple set her knitting aside entirely and folded her hands in her lap, a gleam in her eye, as though some piece of the puzzle had drifted into place. "My dears," she announced, with a tone of confidence that captured immediate attention, "have patience. Sometimes the simplest answers are the ones we overlook. That's how it was with our teacher's assumption about the egg yolk, and it might be the same here." Before anyone could press her to explain, Lucy, Miss Marple's maid, appeared in the doorway. She dipped her head politely. "Dinner is ready, madam," she said, her voice calm and collected. "Oh, splendid," Miss Marple replied, turning back to her guests with a benevolent smile. "I do believe we've done quite enough speculating for one afternoon, especially on empty stomachs. Let's all go in. After we've eaten, I promise I shall reveal the truth to you." Alfred, Joan, and Raymond exchanged glances brimming with anticipation, yet none of them dared to contradict Miss Marple's gentle decree. In truth, they were worn thin by fruitless theories and near-endless speculation. If Miss Marple felt she had something substantial to speak, they rose from their seats, Alfred carefully returning a decorative cushion that had slipped to the floor. Joan and Raymond led the way through the door, following Lucy's guidance, toward the dining room. Miss Marple lingered a moment longer, briefly scanning the tidy sitting room as if taking note of every item. The delicate vase of fresh flowers near the mantel, the small clock ticking softly by the window, the faint indentation in the rug where Alfred had been pacing. Then, seemingly satisfied, she shuffled forward, her lavender-scented skirts trailing against the carpet. As they made their way down the short hallway, the sounds of silverware on china and the tantalizing aroma of roasted vegetables filled the air. Dinner at Miss Marple's was always a comforting affair, simple, yet delicious, much like her approach to life itself. None of them knew what she intended to share, only that it held the promise of illuminating the mystery of Leo's will. Yet in those few steps between the sitting room and the dining room, there was a palpable sense that something significant had shifted. Perhaps the solution was simpler than any of them realized. Perhaps, like the teacher's lesson about the egg yolk, they had been fixating on the wrong details, allowing assumptions to mislead them. The guests seated themselves around the small, polished table, the glow of the chandelier illuminating their expectant faces. Miss Marple took her customary place at the head, Lucy standing by to serve. A curious tension thrummed in the air, as though each person anticipated some extraordinary revelation to accompany the meal. And if the soft, knowing smile on Miss Marple's face was anything to go by, they would not be disappointed. She merely lifted her napkin, settled it in her lap, and looked upon her nephew and friends with kindly eyes. "Eat first," she said serenely, "and then we'll settle this once and for all." Chapter 7. A pen full of secrets. Evening descended upon Miss Marple's drawing room like a softly woven tapestry. Lamplight glowed in corners where shadows had gathered, and the remnants of a delectable supper lingered on a side table, plates bearing crumbs of fruit tart, cups rimmed with tea leaves. A sense of anticipation filled the space. At the center of attention sat Miss Marple herself, sweet-faced and mild-mannered, hands folded neatly in her lap. She glanced around the room, Alfred still looking unconvinced. Raymond, Miss Marple's nephew, perched on the edge of a high-backed chair, and his wife, Joan, who quietly watched Miss Marple with a twinkle in her eye. Miss Marple waited until the soft chimes of the mantel clock had subsided before speaking. "Well, my dears," she began, her gentle voice carrying an unmistakable authority, "I believe the matter of Leo's will is quite settled now." At those words, a ripple of surprise and mild skepticism crossed Alfred's face. He looked rather pale, as though dreading the realization that someone else had outwitted him. But, to his credit, he leaned forward, giving Miss Marple his full attention. "I beg your pardon, Miss Marple," he said, "but how can that be? We've exhausted every explanation, and none of them made sense." Miss Marple's smile was tinged with sympathy. "My dear Alfred, sometimes the truth is simpler than we think, rather like a children's prank. You see, this isn't so different from that little story I told before dinner. The teacher insisted that egg yolks were white, while a clever child pointed out that in reality, they're yellow." She paused, letting the analogy sink in. "In our case, We've all assumed the ink was genuine. But what if it wasn't? Alfred blinked. You mean, you're suggesting there was some trick involved with the ink? Something to make the writing vanish? Joan, who had been smiling to herself, now spoke up. Precisely, Uncle Alfred, she said, referencing the conversation that had begun before Lucy announced supper. She looked over to Miss Marple for permission to continue, but Miss Marple gestured for her to wait. Clearly, she wanted to unfold the explanation in her own way. Let's recall the scene, Miss Marple resumed, in a tone reminiscent of an instructor explaining a puzzle to her class. Leo asked for the pen from the right-hand drawer, but the maid, at the prompting of Jorge and Mary, handed him one from the left-hand drawer instead. The pen from the left drawer contained ink that was, shall we say, unreliable. Jorge and Mary concocted it using a mixture of starch, water, and a few drops of iodine, a classic formula for what is often called disappearing ink. Raymond leaned forward, intrigued. I've heard of that in children's trick kits, where you write something, and then, after a short while, the writing fades completely. Exactly, Miss Marple said with a satisfied nod. As a girl, I often played with similar substances in my youth, purely in the spirit of harmless fun, of course. But in this instance it was put to far more consequential use. Alfred's brow creased. But Amelia and Smith, they were pressing Leo for a will that favored them. Why would they sabotage it themselves? They didn't, Miss Marple replied gently. That was the beauty of the ruse. Everyone assumed Amelia and Smith must have been behind the vanishing text, yet if you think about it, they had no reason to destroy the will. They wanted it to stand, so they could inherit the bulk of Leo's wealth. Raymond, putting the pieces together, let out an exclamation. So the ones who truly benefited from the will disappearing were Jorge and Mary, the rightful heirs under the original will, or at least the older document that might have been drawn up before this final attempt. They wanted to ensure Leo's new will was invalid. Joan clapped her hands softly in excitement. And thus they manufactured the entire scenario, she added. They worked with the maid, who ensured Leo wrote the new will with disappearing ink. Within a few days, the writing vanished, leaving behind nothing but a blank sheet of paper. A moment of charged silence followed. Alfred rubbed his temples as if this revelation had suddenly given him a pounding headache. But the maid, he managed, as she had so little time. The bag fell to the floor for only a few seconds. How could she accomplish that right then? Miss Marple offered a patient smile. Sometimes, dear Alfred, a few seconds is all it takes. The maid didn't need to do anything complicated in that moment. Her main task was to deliver the incorrect pen. The rest was already in motion. And, to be sure, any slip of the bag may have been an intentional distraction or simply an accident, but it did allow her to reassure herself that the plan was proceeding. Remember, by that point the will was already written using the disappearing ink. Whether the bag fell or not, the fate of the document was sealed. Alfred stared into space for a moment, clearly reliving the scene in his mind. Then everything fits, he said slowly. Jorge and Mary had the motive. To nullify Leo's attempt to favor Amelia and Smith, they had the means, a concoction of disappearing ink, and they had the opportunity, through the unwitting assistance of the maid, who introduced the wrong pen at the right time. Joan laughed, a delighted, light-hearted sound that seemed to dispel the tension in the room. Oh, Uncle Alfred, if only you'd discovered this sooner, she teased gently. Amelia and Smith might have ended up with that estate after all. Raymond joined in, smothering a grin. Perhaps it's for the best that Miss Marple solved it first. Better that Leo's estate remains with his own blood. After all, Amelia and Smith had no legitimate claim, aside from the manipulations they employed. For a moment Alfred looked wounded, then broke into a rueful smile. I suppose you're right. It seems I allowed myself to be blinded by assumptions, much like that teacher who insisted the yolk was white. I saw a puzzle where the answer was lurking in plain sight. Miss Marple's eyes sparkled with kindness as she regarded him. "We all make such mistakes at times," she said softly. "The point is to recognize them and move on." Alfred gave a slight nod, as though accepting his lesson with grace. Then, as though sensing a shift in mood, Miss Marple gathered her knitting once again. "Now," she said, "I believe there's some dessert left in the kitchen. Lucy mentioned something about a lemon sponge." She cast a pointed glance at her nephew. "Raymond, be a dear and fetch it, would you? We've had quite enough solemn talk for one evening." As he stood to comply, Joan followed eagerly, and Alfred lingered a moment, still stunned by the sheer simplicity of it all. But Miss Marple remained her usual calm self, her knitting needles clicking gently in her lap. In the hallway, Raymond's voice could be heard, jovial and bright, and Joan's laughter echoed in response. The tension of the mystery had evaporated, replaced by a warmth that seemed to fill every corner of the room. Miss Marple merely smiled to herself, as if well satisfied that order had been restored. And indeed, in the gentle lamplight of her snug home, it felt as though a great weight had lifted, and that, at last, old truths had come properly to light. And that concludes today's journey into the shadows of mystery and deduction. What did you think of this case? Did you see the twist coming, or did it catch you by surprise? Share your theories and favorite moments in the comments below. Love to hear your take. And if you're craving more thrilling detective tales, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss the next mystery. Until then, stay curious. The next clue might be closer than you think it.